Hello, everyone, and welcome to the quarterly search report webinar from Searchmetrics. Q3 is done. However, if you're like us at the Searchmetrics offices, the past few months went by pretty quickly with summer and everything. However, this is why we are here. We're here to talk about Google updates and to make sure everyone is still ranking well. Before we dive in, I want to talk about questions a bit. So we love and encourage questions here. I want to make this as conversational as possible. So if something needs a bit more clarification or you want to dive deeper on a topic, just use the Q&A box to send us a message. If you don't see the Q&A box, just press the Q&A button on your bottom taskbar. I also want to point you all to the resources box. We put the slides there, a PDF link there for you, so you can access those and the links included whenever you would like to. Also, there's a few other supporting materials in there. So just a little bit about us, Searchmetrics. We are a global provider of search data, software, and consulting solutions. We have been experiencing tremendous growth. We have thousands of brands that we represent and many more users. We just opened a Chicago office, and that is where I am sitting in. I am Patty Johnson, the Senior Content Marketing Manager here. However, our speaker is Tom Wells, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Patty, and thanks to each and every one of you who signed up for the Q3 review today. So as Patty said, I'm Tom Wells. I'm an SEO analyst at Searchmetrics, and I really like to get deep into the data so we can look at industry trends and see and try and make sense of what Google's trying to tell us to do. So today we've got a whole bunch of interesting topics, and I'm really excited to get started with it. So without further ado, I think we're just going to get right into it. So the talk today is split into 4 parts. Part 1, we're going to be looking at some of the most recent Google updates from Q3. Then we're going to head into the technical corner where I give you some tips on how you can actually analyze whether your website's been affected by one of these updates. Then we're going to look at some broader industry trends, including real-life case studies with brand new data. So we can actually look at some brands, including e-commerce brands, and see have they been affected by Core Web Vitals, or even how they were able to capitalize on that and potentially increase their mobile revenue. And finally, we're going to do a bit of a data deep dive. And I promise, if you bear with me, it will all make sense. I'll take my time explaining the points. And at the end, you should have a whole bunch of useful takeaways. Now, as Patty said at the top of the show, if any of you have any questions regarding any of the Google updates, any of the metrics, any of the data sources that I mentioned, or you just need a point clarifying, please hit us up in the question box, and I'll do my very best to answer as many questions as we possibly can. And we are going to leave ample time at the end for a decent Q&A session. So if you don't have a question now, get thinking about one, because you will have time, and I will go into detail on that. So what happened in Q3? So by now we've all heard of Core Web Vitals. So the Core Web Vitals update was part of the larger page experience update. Now, effectively what Google's trying to do is gauge whether a website has a good page experience. And if it is, feed that into its core algorithm and potentially give ranking benefits to sites with good page experience. Today, we're mainly going to be focusing on the Core Web Vitals aspect, which is 3 core metrics that we'll get into. Because that actually plays the largest role and affects web traffic in the largest way. So when was this update released? It started rolling out in mid-June. This was confirmed by Google themselves, and the update is actually completed as of August. What that means is we actually have some good data already to check whether this update was significant and see how websites and industries are actually reacting to it. So as I mentioned, Core Web Vitals is part of the larger page experience update. So I'm just going to briefly touch on this, that there are some other aspects to the page experience update as well, including whether your site is mobile friendly, and particularly whether you run all your pages through HTTPS, which is more secure than the classic HTTP. They're the 2 main other additionals to page experience. All taken together make the page experience update. But like I said today, we're mainly going to be focusing on Core Web Vitals. So other update news that you may or may not be aware of that's definitely industry relevant. So Google's actually going to be removing the the Google AMP badges from most of the content that it displays. Now, if you're not familiar with that, Google AMP is strictly for mobile sites. And it was Google's effort to try and encourage webmasters and content creators to speed up the mobile web, which we all know is pretty slow and in general doesn't provide a great experience. Now, AMP was quite controversial because the rules about how you define the various HTML tags was relatively strict. Some people liked it, a lot of people didn't. Google's actually kind of backing away from this now and removing the AMP tag. What does that mean for content creators? Probably good news, because if you want to get your news stories up in Google's top news stories carousel, AMP is no longer a requirement. They are testing this currently, but I expect this to actually complete in the next few weeks. So what that means is you'll see more news stories entering the carousel that don't necessarily have the AMP badge.
Hey, Tom,
so the technical corner. All right, let's check that out.
Someone named Colin has asked, how do you expect Google's changes to attribution will impact search advertising?
How do I expect Google's changes to attribution will impact search advertising? That's actually, I'm going to go through a few more slides before I come back to that question, because I think what I'm about to discuss may answer that in itself. But I will bear that in mind, and I will refer to that in one of the upcoming slides, particularly when we get onto our case study example. If that doesn't answer your question, write again, and I'll go back into detail. So I'll quickly go into the technical corner first, and then I think chapter 3 should speak to that question. So I did mention a lot of you will want to know, okay, Core Web Vitals, is it a big deal? Is it relevant? Well, Google thinks that it is, and that data is being fed into the core algorithm. What does that mean? It is a ranking signal, so it is something that all webmasters and web devs should absolutely be aware of. If you're familiar with Google Search Console, that's really good news, because Google have released a very easy to use report that you can access through Google Search Console. It's had various names in the last few weeks. It keeps changing. Even I can't keep up with it. But it is known as the Page Experience Report. So you can just click through the tabs and access that. And that will actually do the heavy lifting for you and monitor your Core Web Vitals for your different URLs, for your web domain for you. That is probably the easiest way for people to get started monitoring Core Web Vitals themselves. If you do request the slides after this talk, I have included an advanced case as well. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you have data experts in your team, I recommend reading through the link that I've linked on the slide, because there are also some ways that you can do a little bit more with the data analysis and really drill down into what are your problem pages, which URLs are causing you grief in terms of Core Web Vitals. And there's a really nice tutorial that takes you through it step by step. Really recommend, worth reading. Yeah.
Someone asked about, a page speed plugin for WordPress. Instead, would you recommend, instead of the plugin, using the site that you just mentioned?
So any good page speed plugin for WordPress. Now, on a note on plugins, I get asked this a lot. I personally don't recommend specific plugins for specific web builders. What I specialize in is looking at larger industry trends and really giving frameworks and takeaways that anyone could use for any website. I tend to not necessarily advocate for plugins all the time. What I can say about WordPress in particular is there was a news article in Search Engine Land or Journal, I always get those two confused, this morning, that actually revealed that WordPress are looking into having an internal performance Core Web Vitals team. So they've actually recognized that WordPress Core Web Vitals performance isn't great. And they're actually looking to try and solve those problems in-house rather than put the onus on the web dev and the webmasters to actually use third-party plugins and get very mixed results. Because I could recommend a plugin, but then it bulks up your web page, and every need is so specific that it really is a case by case. basis. Something to keep an eye on though, check out with WordPress, shoot them some messages and ask them, get their status updates, because they do look like they're getting serious about coming up with their own Core Web Vitals in-house performance team, which is obviously great news. Thanks for the question, by the way. So we're going to move on to industry, looking at industry trends. What is the key trend that I've identified from Q3? The key trend that I've identified is that brands are targeting Core Web Vitals performance improvements, and they're also, off the back of that, trying to build a performance culture within their organizations. So what do I mean by that? So on the one hand, yes, they have reacted to Core Web Vitals. For some reason, this update has made web devs and businesses sit up and go, okay, this is something we need to be aware of. We need to react to it. But what good web dev teams have actually done is go, this is a really good way to get buy-in to actually, timeline all of our improvement projects that we've been wanting to do, but have potentially got left by the wayside over the last couple of years because of, internal pressures, lack of time, lack of resources, whatever it's been. So it's really positive news. There are plenty of examples online. We're going to explore one in detail, and I'm going to refer to a couple more. So we're going to be looking at Swappy. Swappy is an e-com brand, so very, very focused on quick revenue, sales, conversions. And that's exactly why I selected this example, because really I want part of this talk to also explain to you how website performance really can and does and should link to revenue, and how you can connect business metrics to your improvement efforts. I personally believe that's a great way to go. Swappy also did, and they've actually got some pretty stunning results. So I did a deep dive on their data. They've published the case study online. I took it a little bit further and actually looked at their data for a 20-month period. So by focusing on Core Web Vitals and trying to improve their performance over a 2 to 3 month period, they were actually able to increase their mobile revenue by 42%, which is incredibly significant. So we're actually going to look at what happened and how they did that, and pull some takeaways from that, hopefully. So the Core Web Vitals, I'm going to be explaining what they are as we go through the slides. If people are very unclear about each metric, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to break it down into its simplest terms. The first metric of the Core Web Vitals is LCP, largest contentful paint. All you guys have to remember is that is a proxy for loading time. It measures how quick the largest element on a page loads, usually a hero banner or something like that. In the Core Web Vitals, Google is trying to say, this is a simplistic way of measuring how quick your page loads. And it's, in my opinion, a little bit better than other methods, just looking at session length or the old speed index metric. This is just kind of a neat way of capturing that initial load, particularly for mobile users, because mobile users want a quick load time for the largest element above the fold, right? That is, it says a lot more about the user experience than some other classic metrics. So with that said, knowing that this is loading time for Swappy, the chart shows both desktop and mobile loading time performance over a 20-month period from January 2020 all the way out to August this year. The green shaded box shows when Swappy actually made concerted efforts to improve this loading performance. And after the green box, there's a little bit of a plateau, but around April or May, right in time for the Core Web Vitals update, we actually see both desktop and mobile LCP decrease. What that means is loading time got less, which is an improved and better experience for their users. To quantify that, from October to August, they were able to decrease loading time from around 4 seconds to around 2.8. Now, when I actually use the numbers like that, it becomes very tangible, because we can actually imagine, waiting over 4 seconds just for to buy an iPhone or to browse on an e-com store is incredibly frustrating. And we definitely know as marketers that, the longer you have to wait to take an action, the more likely the user is to bounce, which is why it's so relevant for this industry, for e-com, because, they want to minimize bounce rate, maximize revenue. So this is a really interesting trend. FID, the second core web vital, is first input delay. Now this measures interactivity. So basically how long a user has to wait after they've clicked a button or scrolled down the page for the actual page itself to react. So all you have to do is think of it like waiting time for the user. For Swappy, this wasn't an issue on desktop, which is why you see no blue line at all. The sort of red-orange line shows that FID was a huge issue. The little hashed green line around the 100 mark on the chart is Google's guide for a good benchmark. Now, we see that the shaded box is when Swappy implemented its improvements. Actually, interestingly, there was a spike afterwards, but then they got a handle on the issue, and now on desktop and mobile, they've effectively got no user delay whatsoever. So again, this confirms the trend that they're making concerted efforts to improve user experience. CLS, probably one of the most confused metrics out there at the minute. Cumulative layout shift is the third core web vital of 3. All it does is measure image stability. Now, what that means is how much images or even banners or other page elements jump around on a page while that page is loading. That is what CLS measures. It's given as a score. It's not a time, okay? For a good score in Google, you'd need to have a 0.1. Most sites are actually kind of outside of that, but 0.1 would be a really good score. Looking at the orange line for Swappy, we see a huge spike all the way out to 0.6. But after they've, their web dev team really looked at what that issue was, they got a handle on it and really got it down to a very acceptable level. So all 3 metrics they improved with targeted efforts for the core vitals. Now, why is that relevant? Well, first I'm going to say how they did it. There's going to be a lot of people asking me how they did it. Okay, so these are the main solutions that I found reading through the case study that Swappy's dev team actually kind of were prepared to say. So one way was they rendered LCP elements server-side, not client-side. That's a little bit of an advanced use case, but effectively it's a way of speeding up the rendering process for the largest element on a page. Good web devs will be more than aware of how to do that. Images is a huge one. They chose to lazy load images that are below the fold. So they're only loading images for products that people can see above the fold, and sometimes using preloading as well to save the overall loading time. They went through and used the correct sizes for images, and then they optimized them as well, which means that they were uploaded at the correct size without losing any quality. Often on e-com sites, we've all used a WordPress uploader. We just batch upload, a few images. We select them from the gallery, put them in our blog or our landing page, and then we're done, right? So, that's not really a great way to go. So they actually went through, resized the images, got that overall page size down, and saw massive performance gains. They also changed their font provider. They removed any unused widgets and scripts where they didn't need them. And I've also provided a link to the case study for all of you guys to read through in your own time as well. And there was a lovely quote as well from the engineering lead saying, you need to link site speed to business metrics to truly highlight the importance of it. And I feel like that quote really sums up the whole of Q3, the whole of the SEO industry right now. So their business results, 42% increase in mobile revenue. They increased the relative share. So the share of mobile revenue from just 24% versus desktop to 34%. And as I said, there are many other examples of brands really taking a performance culture, doing these relatively simple optimizations. It can be something as reducing the size of images, changing your font provider, those kind of back to basics optimizations. But it's nice to see that people are reporting real business results.
Hey, Tom. We have a few more questions coming in.
Yeah,
Katie.
I've seen. So this is a great time to pause and answer a few of those.
Yeah, definitely. Katie had a few good questions on one in particular was on CLS. Would you recommend removing animations to improve the score?
In general, yes, because it simply it keeps it simple. Now, I know that sounds silly, but often what causes a problem is actually the pipeline that you go from A to B, right? You know, if every stakeholder did things the same way every single time, you know, having an animation that you could rely on would not really be an issue. But, you know, we know that, you know, if you modify part of the site, often, you know, something like an animation can actually break. It can behave differently on different pages, on different devices, on different browsers. And it's kind of tricky and a bit of a pain to actually keep track of the actual performance of those animations. And it can actually be hard to isolate which animation is causing which layout shift. So, you know, if you can kind of get away without using that animation, it's just making it slightly easier to actually review what elements on your page could be causing that layout shift. So I would recommend moving away from those if possible.
Okay.
I'm seeing another one from Katie. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it true that you must be good? Is it true that you must be good in all three core vitals to be rewarded by Google? That's an excellent question, and my data analysis section of the talk is going to answer that absolutely in as much depth as you could ever hope to want. It's true that you must be good in all three core vitals to pass the core vitals assessment. Now, how can you see if your page does that? You can, after this talk, hopefully not during, you know, I promise, bear with me, and we'll get to a really, really interesting live Q&A where I go through all of these questions. But obviously some of these metrics are quite nuanced and do require a certain amount of explanation and also a little bit of patience on the side of the listener. And I do really appreciate that. So if you get a good score, which Google provides clear benchmarks for in the three core vitals I've outlined, your site will be deemed as passing the core vitals assessment. Now, it's not true that you have to pass core vitals to be rewarded by Google. How do I know that? Because Google measures every single session across your entire domain. So often, you know, one page might have a bad session, another one might have a good one. Google averages all of that out and uses the absolute numbers and feeds all of that straight into the algorithm. It doesn't go, okay, this site failed, therefore it will be punished straight away. You can think of it more of a sliding scale. So with that said, we will move into the data section. It is data heavy, but I really do make a point of trying to look at industry trends to keep it as real for you guys as I possibly can. As soon as we're through the data, we will get through all of these great questions that I can see coming in. So the Core Vitals deep dive. Why is this exciting? Why am I personally excited about it? Well, it's new data, which is already good. For the first time, I've actually managed to take the top 100 domains in the US for desktop and mobile and check the Core Vitals performance for all of those domains over a period of 20 months. So this is pretty comprehensive. The reason that I did this is because I wanted to see how well do the top domains, and I say top 100, the top 100 ranked by Searchmetrics' own metric, SEO visibility, which looks at traffic, expected traffic. It's really impressive and nuanced and an incredible way of coming up with these lists. And I didn't stop there. I also did the same thing for 8 different industries. So it gets really interesting when we start to compare industries rather than just looking with this granular view at our own site or our own industry. So just seeing one question come in, Google's John Muller is on record multiple times that Core Vitals is more of a tiebreaker ranking factor than a baseline for appearing in SERPs. Is it reasonable to infer that Core Vitals improvements impact the bottom line more due to how they improve user experience than SEO performance? Okay, that is an excellent question. The reason I'm choosing to stop before we do the data deep dive, I'm seeing the question came from Norm Vogler from one of the companies that we've got here. Super exciting question. Again, nuanced. I like to think that, you know, user experience and SEO performance are intrinsically linked. You know, a good user experience also for me is a good SEO performance, right? If we break it down to its most simplistic part, what is largest contentful paint? It is in effect loading time. Ask any user out there in the industry, do you want a good loading time? The answer is, well, I want a good user experience. And part of that is a site that loads quickly. I want to get my shopping done. I don't want laggy pages with images jumping around. I want a good, robust, solid, quick user experience. So, of course, positive user signals resulting from improved loading times do feed into the algorithm and help rank your site. But the core vitals is part of that. And I personally expect their role to be increased, just looking at the way that the data is playing out. I agree. I mean, of course, John Muller's on record. He's an authority from Google. I'm just, a more minor authority from Searchmetrics, let's say. The tiebreaker analysis, keeping everything else the same. If we have two identical e-com brands, the same number of pages and backlinks and all other factors, if one has a better core vital score, my opinion is that, yes, it will rank higher. However, the same can be said for lots of other ranking factors as well. So it's an argument to kind of take with a pinch of salt. Again, I would also refer back to the business metrics of case studies like Swappy, like we looked at. We can begin to see that improving loading performance not only helps SEO, as we know SEO, but it can be linked to direct increases in revenue as well, both on organic and paid campaigns. So thank you, Norm. If I didn't answer that in detail enough, I'll get to it at the end. So without further ado, let's look at the core vitals performance for the top 100 in the United States. Okay, how many passed the core vitals? And as we already had the nice question, passing core vitals means getting a good score in all three metrics. The short answer is 51%, both on desktop and 51% on mobile. So we have a parity at the minute. The Crux average, which is the Chrome User Experience Report, reports an average of 31.3% of all domains based on 8.4 million domains passing. So we can say that the top 100 in the US is certainly above average. And we can see as well, if we look at the chart, the trend goes quite steeply upwards. So in January 2020, only around 22% and 28% roughly of desktop and mobile respectively were passing core vitals. Again, remember, this is only based on the top 100 domains in the US as determined by Searchmetrics. But fast forward 20 months, and those sites have realized a lot of performance gains. Because if they hadn't, they wouldn't be able to pass the core vitals assessment. And those percentages have effectively more than doubled, reaching 51 right now. The green shaded box is the core vitals rollout period. That's just there for a reference for us to see how did traffic and how did those metrics actually change during the critical rollout phase. Broken down by metric, again, largest contentful paint, all you have to remember is loading time. So the downward trend here means loading time has improved significantly. The average loading time for a mobile site in the top 100 US domains is 2.51 seconds, a hair outside of Google's good benchmark, which is 2.5, denoted by the green line. Desktop is under this, 2.36. So what that means is the majority of top 100 domains in the US are actually better than Google's good benchmark for LCP, which marks a major improvement. Rewind just to January 2020, even mid-year, we were out around over 3 seconds for both devices, which is, a huge difference. Conscious of time, I'm just going to touch on the points that I really believe to be the absolute most important. Cumulative layout shift is a really interesting case of how going back through the data can show how Google tests different ways of measuring a metric. So what do I mean by that? Remember, layout shift measures different images jumping around a page. As such, Google actually found itself struggling to accurately capture this metric. So if you just focus in on the blue line of the chart and you see the massive hump in the line from around September 2020 to around March 2021, about a 6-7 month period. I personally believe that this massive bump in the data was Google playing around with how it measured CLS. So, being more lenient and then being more strict, we got very wide ranging scores. But as we move through 2021 and into the rollout period, Google's got a very stringent and strict way of measuring CLS that is improved and much more accurate. I have actually linked an article of Google's web dev blog actually explaining how they measure CLS and how it has evolved, which does bear out in the data. So if you access the slides and read through that link, it is an interesting read. The key takeaway is that CLS is also improving over time, and it's significantly improved for both desktop and mobile devices, with the top 100 just outside the good benchmark, which is 0.1, as we mentioned before, for the top 100 domains, that is. FID, we don't have enough hours in the day to talk about why this metric is problematic. All that I will say is that if you are quoted metrics or studies about first input delay, take them with a grain of salt. The reason that most quoted scores or most sites are given as passing FID is actually because Google actually struggles to collect the data it needs to measure this metric. If you think about interactivity, you actually need a user to come to a page and try and scroll or click on a button before this metric can be measured, before it can effectively be activated. Often with bounce sessions or users not taking those actions, Google simply records a 0, nevertheless counting it as a pass. This has put massive bias into this metric, meaning that what we have is a data set where most domains automatically de facto pass FID, means we can't really draw meaningful conclusions from this at this moment in time. It's here for completeness, though, and to spark debate. So looking at the different segments, this is actually an industry split. Now, this is based on the 8 industries, and I've put our top 100, which is all the industries and the top 100 of those combined, as a reference. These are the percentages of these industries passing Core Vitals as of August 2021. This data is super fresh. I've rigorously analyzed everything for you guys. And what's interesting is we can see that the healthcare industry for desktop, so desktop in these graphics is the blue bar, and orange or red, depending on your display, is the mobile. Desktop is at 70% of these domains passing Core Vitals. We go all the way down through the different industries to fashion and travel, which the common theme will be that they're lagging way, way behind. Okay, we'll get onto reasons why, and we'll also split the metrics and so you can actually see why that's happened. Also, the general trend, as we would expect, is mobile performance is generally slightly worse, but maybe not as bad as some of us would expect. So done by metric, we effectively will be seeing the same pattern repeat. Now, again, low LCP is good, so the graphic is effectively reversed. Healthcare and B2B dictionary sites all seem to have quick, therefore good loading times, which is really interesting. The top 100 sit there somewhere in the middle. Travel and fashion significantly bringing up the rear there in terms of 3.5 seconds, super slow loading times for them. It's really interesting when you split it out by industry to notice these. Cumulative layout shift. This was another interesting one. Again, B2B and healthcare doing super well. I was surprised to see dictionary in 4th place because I would expect, sites like Wikipedia and the dictionaries to have a better handle on their images simply because they don't have many, but they were beaten out by healthcare and B2B. And as we would expect, the image-heavy branches of travel and fashion generally have pretty poor CLS scores across devices. Okay, that could be expected, but it also plays into the whole narrative of certain industries do exhibit much worse user experience. And bear in mind that these tests are fair. I've selected all of the top performing brands from these industries and then compared them with another. It's not like I just chose awful sites in fashion and compared them to great B2B sites. It was a fair test. So the key takeaways from the heavy data that we've been fighting our way through. Here on this final graphic, I do want to spend just a minute or two explaining what we're actually looking at, because I do think it gives a very, very valuable takeaway. What I've done is I've actually charted mobile loading time over time for the different industries that we just looked at. And I wanted to focus purely on mobile performance. And And if you look at the two yellow circles, it's highlighting the beginning and the end of the red fashion line. So from January 2020 to August 2021, mobile LCP in fashion has only decreased, has only improved from 3.55 to 3.26 seconds. This is in 20 months. In other industries, we're seeing massive gains. Similar is true for travel. So it's not necessarily that, in January 2020 that, certain industries were super fast and certain were super slow. I perceive it more as over this period of time, the last 18 to 20 months, other industries have realized much, much bigger gains. And this is a much, much, more robust claim than simply saying there has been an improvement. Because if there's an improvement in certain industries and not in others, we really begin to say that it's down to the performance of the individual sites rather than simply just Google playing with the algorithm. So that's really the value of the industry comparison. And the key takeaway is that, brands that have made the effort to improve their mobile performance do realize, business revenue gains, looking at Swappy. And industries like fashion and travel only have the most to gain. The baseline performance is so low that making a gain in that industry is therefore much easier. So there's never been a better time to actually optimize for those features. So we are going to move on to the Q&A, and I've seen plenty of questions buzzing in our little inbox here, and I'll be happy to take my time and go through those. I would at this stage say thank you very much to everyone who stuck with us through the data rabbit hole. I hope it was enjoyable. It certainly was for me. So thank you very much for listening to everyone out there. And now we'll go through hopefully some of the interesting questions. So I'm just going to read through the first one so far. This is from Katie Schwend. How often does my site go through the Core Vitals test? Now that Swappy accomplished the lower scores, do they need to make daily adjustments to stay there? Two questions in one. We got a 2-for-1 deal, and both are really valid. How often does my site go through the Core Vitals test? Okay. The simple answer to that is that Google aggregates the data monthly from most data sources. It's usually an average of the last 28 days. Okay, from today. Different data sources will quote different times that they aggregate the data. The key data set that we as SEOs have access to online is called the Chrome User Experience Report, CRUX for short. That's aggregated every month and released a little bit later. I would suspect, although I don't work at Google, that Google use a snapshot of the last 28 days of that domain's performance, effectively average that out across the domain or the URL, and then implement that into the core algorithm. So now that Swappy accomplished the low scores, do they need to make daily adjustments? I would say that it's really a good idea to set up a dashboard. Again, I gave the advice, Google Search Console, have an automated report. I also linked to how you can create these dashboards yourself with a tutorial. By monitoring your performance over time, you can really identify problematic pages or problematic categories of pages and begin to sort of make optimizations. Usually once you've made an optimization, you wouldn't really have to repeat that. If you've uploaded a product image and it's the right size, it's always going to remain that right size. It's not like Swappy are going in every single day and changing everything. It was more of a list of problematic pages that they systematically worked through. And now those pages should be working correctly. So thanks, Katie. 2 great questions in one. I would argue that so we got a question from Troy East. I would argue that the tiebreaker scenario would hinge more on the content matched to the query, not core vitals. Okay, so we're going back to this tiebreaker concept. Yes, obviously, the core vitals is a small part of the Google algorithm. Google takes different parts of different ranking factors based on so many different factors that we can't possibly begin to analyze every single one. And the tiebreaker scenario that John Muller put forward in his talk, it's really meant in a metaphorical way. And the way that I interpret that is that holding all of the factors equal, it's much more logical that, and again, holding all of the factors equal would include the content as well. that something like loading speed could be used to be, to actually break that deadlock. So we got a question from Samantha Hillman. So how are brands linking to these updates to an increase in revenue? How can they tell it's from improving core vital score? Well, quite simply, exactly how Swappy did it, right? They had a core vitals dashboard, and they measured that over time. And specifically, that improvement was attributed to the increasing revenue. So I hear what you're saying, was there extra paid campaigns? How can we, it's the question of attribution. But there are other case studies where the only element that was changed was a core vital factor, and the similar results were observed. A specific example would be a Vodafone case study that's also on the web dev blog. Vodafone did an experiment of paid landing pages, and they had one poorly optimized landing page and then one where they specifically targeted LCP, so the loading time. So the loading time of one was effectively 8 seconds and the loading time of another was 5. And they saw a significant increase in revenue on the quicker landing page. But again, all of these things aren't rocket science. We know that quicker pages convert, and that's higher. And that's all that Core Web Vitals is saying, right? Improve your LCP is, effectively will decrease your bounce rate over time. It's not saying that improving Core Web Vitals will change the relevance of your content or change your site structure or change how you have to interact with users. It's a small part of user experience that's nevertheless absolutely critical to get right. So thanks, Samantha, to that question. So we're going to move on to the next one from Viviana. Our website has mostly videos as hero images above the fold. Any recommendations? Video is certainly can be a little bit tricky to get right. I would really look into things like lazy loading. So it depends. So you say you've got videos as hero images above the fold. I'm just wondering if you've got product pages with multiple videos. If so, the usual principle is to load one element and lazy load the rest below the fold as the user scrolls down. So that effectively stops you loading lots of elements at the same time. If you're talking about the specific element itself, one great way is also to load a thumbnail image of the video and to have that play only when the user interacts with it, rather than loading, megabytes of data in the back end unnecessarily. So only when the user engages. That can also be done asynchronously. There are things like preloading as well. But again, Google has a lot of resources on how to actually optimize specific assets. But in general, the principle is try and minimize what's above the fold and load it as quick as possible. And using an image or a thumbnail in place of the actual video player, depending on the specific logic that you have, could also be one way to go. So see, we got another question from Troy. I might be answering them in reverse chronological order, so apologies if I'm touching on the same things again. Can you give your take on content diversity's relationship with Core Vitals? First meaningful pain, etc., and how content diversity is being rewarded by Google. Diversity being things that increase page engagement, videos, GIFs, clickable events, etc. Okay, content diversity, very interesting topic. So I believe what reading between the lines a little bit, what Troy is getting at there is does having different elements on your page, effectively making the content more diverse, is that actually rewarded by Google? What is always rewarded by Google is positive user signals. So you can always bring it back to that. If you believe that, videos, GIFs, clickable events serve the purpose of that page, then of course it will be rewarded, because what's rewarded by Google is first rewarded by users. That's really the key takeaway. And that I know it sounds simplistic, but that is the key takeaway of pretty much everything. So the reverse engineering would be, what do your users love to see? And what is their ideal form of content? What is most rewarding and most engaging to them? How do they like to consume content? Having that answer would probably give you a good picture of what you would need to include on your pages for those specific users. Okay, thanks, Troy. So we've got a question from Chris van der Loon. Do you know that minimum site data Google Search Console needs for a page experience report? My accounts say not enough data. I don't know the exact minimum requirements. I do know that's an issue with Google Search Console in general. In that case, Chris, request the slides from our amazing team and go back to that slide where I mentioned it will be just after Technical Corner. And for you, I'd recommend checking out that advanced use case. There is a methodology, which I won't go into detail, that effectively takes Google Analytics Core Vitals data, which is a new addition to GA4, sends that to BigQuery, and you can effectively build a real-time dashboard. And as far as I know, that wouldn't have a minimum data requirement. And I think that would absolutely solve your problem. The implementation time for someone good with data would be around an hour and a half. And reading through that guide would probably take 15 minutes. So really worth doing that. The GSC, the Google Search Console way of Core Vitals reporting is quite basic, but they've made it like that because it meets the needs of most users. But they didn't really think of the problem that low traffic sites or new sites just coming into the market can't really accurately measure their data. So go back and check out that slide and check out that tutorial, and I really hope that that will help you with that question. So we've got a question from Kelsey here. So saying, we're failing Core Vitals and have seen a dip in our US rankings, but Hong Kong, we're seeing an increase. We have the same website for both locations. What do you think this could be from? This is a really difficult question to answer because, websites can be geo-specific, Google's algorithm can be geo-specific, and Core Vitals can be geo-specific. I'm currently in the process of also pulling the same data for Germany, so I can do a US-German comparison to really see, is there a Core Vitals trend in Europe versus America? I really think that it often boils down to the competition that's in that geo, and also how the users are sending their user signals as well. So what I try and look at is there somehow a difference in your Hong Kong users versus your US users? And also, what's the actual overall competition in the market? Because if you say you've seen an increase in Hong Kong, it's possible that other competitors close to you are actually doing much worse in Core Vitals than you, which gives the boost. But the opposite can also be true in the US. So without the data in front of me, it would be impossible to make an informed analysis. But I would just investigate what's going on in those two geos to basically take a look at it and from that approach. Does Searchmetrics have a Core Vitals checklist on possible solutions to increase scoring, e.g. lazy loading, pre-rendering, sort of? Thank you, Dan, for that amazing question. So have we put together a checklist? No, not yet. What I can say to everyone as well is in the next few weeks, I'll be publishing all of the data from this talk as a interactive chart style dashboard on the Searchmetrics website. It will feature the top 100 US domains and their Core Vital scores. It will feature the 8 industries that we looked at. It will feature desktop and mobile segmentation, just like we saw it here. And I'll also include on that page recommendations, sort of, perhaps the top 5 ways of improving Core Vital scores. So I'm not exactly sure when we're going to push that live, but definitely check back regularly because we will, as soon as it is live, it will be all over our social and our LinkedIn.
It'll be updated monthly. Is that correct, Tom?
It absolutely will be updated monthly. As soon as the Crux data lands, I will be updating it. So the update for the previous month will come mid-month. So, today we would update September, mid-November we update October. And we're going to keep doing that as well to monitor performance over time. But thanks, Dan. Again, just to speak on that a little bit more, a lot of Core Vitals really goes back to the basics of, sort of good web principles, effectively looking at things like unused JavaScript, widgets that you don't need. Often one of the best ways to get started is identify problem pages and look, what is really slowing these things down? Is it an image? Is it a plugin? And once you get that first element that's really causing this delay, you'll begin to see that you can use that same methodology for lots and lots of pages. And if you're seeing poor performance, there'll be a lot of quick wins for you there. So Troy Eves, again, we've got Recrux. That's not entirely true. They are reporting results based on the number of times your site is crawled versus competitors. I'm not 100% sure what you're referencing there, Troy. If you want to write again and expand on that, I'd be happy to go into detail. If I misspoke on the Crux data versus the crawling, not 100% sure what that one is, so happy to circle back on that if you're still on the online, Troy. While Troy gets back to me on that, we've got something from David Davshian, sorry for the pronunciation. This is very interesting. When I'm trying to check my site's CLS and LCP, the main issue is coming from Facebook and GTM JavaScripts. Do I need to remove these two files and continue without it? Again, this is sort of like the sanity check, right? If you absolutely need something like your analytics, which is pretty crucial, or your Facebook pixel or cookie, whatever you're using, don't just delete them for the sake of web performance. It's about optimizing what's there and getting a balance between good Core Web Vitals performance and the plugins that you actually need as marketers to do the jobs that you need to do. Some plugins are very, very bulky and really slow your site down. And some of them simply aren't needed. But if it's marketing essential, like Google Analytics is for most companies, there's no point deleting it. What I would potentially look at the implementation. Sorry, just reading the how long we've got left for questions. So we actually don't have that long. So I'm so happy that so many questions came in and we're really racing through them. So I will absolutely try and get through as many as possible, as I said. But back to David's question, if you need the plugin, you absolutely have to keep it and work around it. There is no good way. What I would look is the implementation of those plugins. Is the plugin being loaded asynchronously, or is it being loaded as part of the main thread work? That sounds a little bit complicated, but if you follow best practices of how to implement plugins, you know then that you're doing the best job you possibly can do. And, your Core Vitals optimizations can involve other things other than, marketing or data critical plugins. So Samantha, how would you suggest a higher education website begin optimizing for Core Vitals? With so many web users and hundreds of pages, I'm having a hard time trying to improve our scores. Great question. Thank you very much to Samantha for that question. So a higher education website with lots of pages, how would I begin? Well, firstly, you want to identify your worst pages. Okay, so the pages with the worst scores. Check out, if you're connected to Google Search Console, check out the report and see what information you can glean from that report. Okay, and then look at some of the pages that are really problematic, because you'll begin to identify patterns. If you're saying that, it seems to be a site-wide issue, more than likely there's some sort of performance issue built into the logic. It might be the way that you upload images. It might be a loading issue. Identifying it on one of your worst pages will stand you in good stead to also make that improvement as you go along. And I know it can be overwhelming. And if you really need to optimize business efforts, look at a combination of the worst performing pages and the most revenue critical pages, or perhaps in your industry, the most conversion critical pages first, and go from there. So I think we're coming up to the hour. So we've got about 7 minutes left. So not much time left for questions. So can you give us non-techie people any helps for helping the dev team implement this? Yes, I would say invite the dev team to one of my talks, and they can glean all of this wonderful information. First, get your dev team to set up a Core Web Vitals dashboard. I have a slide in this presentation that will tell them how to do this. Read through the Swappy case study, because the Swappy case study that is also linked in this presentation deck actually goes through how that dev team went about doing it. And I believe, John, that your dev team will be more than capable of setting up a dashboard, measuring the performance, looking at problem pages, and beginning to make incremental improvements over time. Swappy did that, and I know a lot of Swappy's engineers were pretty new to the job, but they really hit the ground running and got it done. So I'd recommend reading through, 1, the Swappy case study, and 2, how to set up the dashboard, because you need to track it over time to actually make those improvements. Chris van der Loon again, what's the best way that you recommend to measure CLS? I recommend the method listed on the slide that I already recommended to you, Chris, so that actually neatly ties up that. Coming back to Troy, across industries, are there types of sites, e.g. e-com, that are performing better than others? I believe I answered that with the industry-specific question. So, happy to have answered that question as well. Which is a better tool, Chrome UX Report or PageSpeed Insights? That's from Viviana Toledo. Thank you very much for that question. Both are very good for different purposes. PageSpeed Insights, I would say, is very good in diagnostics, but there are lots of caveats to that. So for those who don't know, if you Google PageSpeed test, you'll get the little blue box, put your URL in, and Google will give all of these weird and wonderful metrics of how your site's performing, and give you a performance score. That's PageSpeed Insights. It's very good at identifying things like maybe JavaScript that you may not need or plugins that you don't need. But you have to be very careful with, is the data lab data? So is it simulated, or is it field data from real world users? So if we're thinking of the Chrome UX report, the real advantage to that is it's real world user data. The pure PageSpeed Insights data is simulated by Google, and therefore it cannot be as accurate, but it can be a very useful diagnostic tool. So I hope that answered your question. So I think we're going to have to get on probably the last one or two questions before we close the chat off. So Joy Herbers, our mobile experience is pretty dreadful because 80% of our customers access our content via desktop. Interesting. Does Google consider this information when ranking our site based on core vitals metrics? Well, Google certainly will look at, is your site mobile friendly? But if your your desktop users are accessing effectively a mobile site, if 80% of your customers are desktop users, it really would be a good idea to consider trying to make a great user experience for the majority of your users, which seem to be desktop. So again, it's not a detailed answer, but I'd really put the users first rather than performance, and try and look at what issues are they having, and how could we resolve those. So with that, I think we'll do one more question before we wrap up. We did manage to get through quite a large amount of questions, which I'm really, really happy to see. Again, sorry, I'm just seeing from Troy, if you got back. Good job fielding all those overall with the juggling and delivery. Okay, cool, great. In that case, Troy, thanks for listening. I'll be in touch. Again, if I misquoted something on the Crux data report, I'd be happy to message you on LinkedIn or whatever it is to iron out any of those things. But I think we're on the same page anyway. Okay, final question. Here we go. The final question is from Molly Quant. Okay, here we go. We recently saw a dip in percentage of good URLs in page experience report. Is this likely due to our own internal change on pages, or could be a change on Google's end? Great question to end on. So Molly, what I would say is you need to go metric specific. As we saw in the charts, and again, please request these slides and pass them on to your performance teams. But as we saw in the charts, CLS had pretty wild changes over that 6-month period, right? And that really was Google measuring it in different ways, whereas LCP and FID were a lot more stable and uniform. So if you break it down into specific metrics and see if there are any patterns there, that would be a really good way to see, is it something Google did, something I did? And usually the truth of the matter is it's a combination of both. So yeah, millions of thanks to everyone who tuned in for this talk, and thanks for the detailed questions. They were really way better than I could have ever expected. So thank you so much for that. Thanks for Searchmetrics and the team in the back end, organizing all of this and keeping us up and running and keeping things go smoothly. And yeah, I would also like to say that, Searchmetrics really is an incredible industry-leading SEO suite with incredible teams behind the scenes, including our digital services group, who can solve just about any problem or solution that we've mentioned in this talk. Yeah, our services team, our DSG team are really rock star level guys when it comes to this stuff. And yeah, shout out to them and everyone who organized this, and to all the users who tuned in. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Handing back to Patty.
Yeah, great questions. Love the engagement there. If there's anything that you would like to comment or reach out to us about, we're always there at hello@searchmetrics.com. If we didn't get to your question, we will be sure to reach out and provide you with an answer there. I just want to remind you that the resources box is available if you would like a copy of the slides to get all those links that Tom referred to. There's also a link to our original Core Web Vitals study that Tom did back in April. And lastly, if you didn't get enough of Tom, he just appeared on the Voices of Search podcast talking about the state of web performance. So that was a really nice chat there. Also, if you have a minute or two, please fill out the survey. We love your insights. There was already one great content idea in the questions there. So just what other topics you would like to see, just let us know. And with that, we will say goodbye for now. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for other webinars. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Take care.